Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Welcome back, Asset Reliability at Work podcast listeners. We are here with Anil Agrawalla for round 2, our episode number 2 on predictive maintenance. If you remember last time, we discussed the difference between predictive maintenance and preventive maintenance. We talked a little bit about the PDM landscape out there in the industry, some best practices, and also some common mistakes that organizations make when setting up their PDM program. So this episode is going to talk more about measuring effectiveness of your PDM programs. And I think all of our listeners are going to get some really good insight on what can make their predictive programs more successful. So let's jump right in. How you doing, Anil? Thanks for joining us again.
Doing great. Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Derek, for having me.
So, Anil, are you finding that facilities are doing a good job in tracking their predictive programs' effectiveness after they've implemented and brought the tools in and are getting some reports? And if not, where are they struggling?
Most companies are doing a pretty good job of measuring their effectiveness, but they certainly have room for improvement. One of the most common KPIs that I see measured is how many data points are captured in a given time frame. So, on their vibration route in total, they may have 1,000 data points that they take, and they'll track whether they're completing 950 points or 990 points. So that's a pretty common one. That's a pretty easy one to track within the software of each given technology. But beyond that, I think there's room for improvement. So let me give you a couple examples. One is, how effective are your PDM routes? Are you doing too many inspections, or are you doing too few inspections? So specifically measuring the ratio of the number of inspections versus how many problems are actually found. So how many PDM fines are you getting versus how many inspections? For the most part, the rule of thumb that we use is there should be, for every 6 inspections, there should be 1 PDM fine. And that balances out the cost benefit of doing the inspection. So if you're measuring that and you're seeing that you're doing, it's taking 12 inspections to have 1 PDM fine, well, maybe you're doing that too frequently, and you can maybe reduce that as you kind of establish that baseline frequency. On the flip side, if you're every 2 inspections you're finding a problem, well, maybe you need to increase that frequency just so you can get a little more heads up on the failure curve, see when it's actually starting to fail. Another KPI that can be measured for the effectiveness of the program is how quickly you're turning around your data collection into an analysis and into a corrective work order being put in. With predictive maintenance, we're getting early detection. We're trying to detect failures as early as possible, but what good is that doing if that data that's being collected sits in your analyzer for a week before it even gets analyzed? Or what if it's getting analyzed and it's not putting into your system to actually be worked on and go into the planning and scheduling phase? So kind of measuring that turnaround time between data collection to analysis and analysis to implementing or putting in the corrective work order. Those are great measuring points to see, hey, are we losing time? Are we spending all this money to get this early detection, but we're losing it just from an efficiency standpoint of collecting to analyzing to putting in the work order.
So what do you think, what would be a good turnaround time for a typical program, or does it really depend on the program, or, is it like within 30 days or, within a week, or what would you say would be a good turnaround time for that data?
There isn't a hard time, but it would be just as soon as possible. And I would say at most it should be something in the 3 to 4 day range. Get your data collection, analyze it as quickly as possible. If you're doing it in-house, certainly if you're outsourcing it to a contractor who's doing the analysis, there may be some additional time delay there, but that should be put into your contract with this vendor saying, hey, when I turn in my data to you, I expect my report back within X amount of days, just so that I can get it in the system and not lose any of that early detection. So that's a great point, Tara, that there should be some time frame either put in a contract or you should be measuring against. And, within that 3 to 4 day range would be ideal.
So now what are some ways to measure your PDM program's success?
There are quite a few ways, but I would say even before we get to the program successes or measuring your program success, part of that is also kind of acknowledging your program's failures. And maybe that's a little bit of a harsh word, but what I'm trying to say is, acknowledge when your PDM program misses something, because that can be a very valuable tool to looking at your program's effectiveness. If something is missed, admit that, hey, predictive maintenance isn't going to catch everything. It's not 100% foolproof. There are lots of reasons why, you may not catch it, right? Your frequency for data collection may be every 3 months, but that specific failure mode may develop, within a month time frame and fail within that month time frame. So there's reasons for it, but admit that you've missed it and figure out why. Along with measuring your program success, acknowledge the failures. Back to measuring your program success, I would say one of the most important things that we can do when managing our program is speak the language of money. And I have a colleague here at LCE that I kind of stole this term from him, and I love it. And he says you should dollarize it. Dollarize your savings. Dollarize what you're doing, right? Put it in a language that management can understand. Right? If you tell them you saved a bearing from failing and you caught it and repaired it before it shut down the system, okay, great. They may have it in a qualitative sense that, okay, yep, you did something good for the company, awesome. But now if you can dollarize that, if you can put a dollar savings or dollar cost avoidance to it, that's a wonderful thing, and that speaks volumes. And there are multiple ways to do this, but one of the ways that I like to do it is think about what would have happened if your predictive program wasn't in place, right? So you're going around doing routes and you're finding failures as condition decreases, right? As these parts start to fail. Well, what happens if you didn't have one? So let's say you have a preventive maintenance job plan in place to inspect for that type of failure along with your predictive maintenance program. Well, you may have caught that at a later date and the damage may have been a little worse at that point. Maybe there would have been some secondary damage. So, hey, the predictive maintenance program, it avoided that additional damage. So you need to think about that type of thing when you think about what would have happened if your predictive maintenance program wasn't in place. Another aspect is, well, how often is this particular asset or system supporting production, right? So you can't say that by replacing this bearing, you would have saved the company $1 million because it's producing $1 million item, but maybe it's not producing that all the time. So take into account how often this asset is being utilized and what percentage of the time it's actually producing that product, and you can maybe take a portion of that savings from that.
So those are some really good tips on ways to measure your PDM program success. Dollarize it. Think about if you had no predictive program in place, and then consider your uptime and how that's being impacted. Do you have any more tips on measuring your result?
Well, I would say even to get to this point, to focus on what's being missed, to dollarize it, even before that, you need to look at, or I would say one of the things is you need to set up your CMMS system to properly track it. So that is a crucial step that sometimes isn't really thought about when setting up the program. And what I mean by that is in your CMMS, whether it be a Maximo or SAP or Infor, whatever it may be, there should be a way to differentiate how many corrective maintenance work orders are being put in from your predictive maintenance program. So a lot of systems, they have it set up where if a corrective maintenance work order is being generated from a PM, it'll code it specifically saying, hey, this was generated from a PM. But your CMMS system needs to differentiate a corrective maintenance work order that was generated from a PDM. So that way you can start measuring, well, okay, how many correctives am I actually putting in, or how many correctives am I actually generating from my predictive program? Another tip is, when you go back to that dollarized aspect and you're trying to measure the financial gain or financial benefit, try and get real downtime numbers from plant management and the finance team, right? Understand your value stream, understand how much your downtime would cost if a particular asset would fail. If it's costing you $20,000 an hour and you're only operating that asset 8 hours a day. Okay, we'll use those numbers. And when you calculate your potential cost avoidance, use those percentages as a factor. And certainly, as you measure your financial gain or even cost avoidance, be conservative on estimates. Cost avoidance is sometimes a tough topic for people to comprehend, right? It's maybe not direct savings that they'll see on their P&L, but if you can give them good logic behind it, and if you're conservative on your estimates, they'll be more in line to believe it.
So, Anil, as we get ready to round out this episode, I want to ask you one final question, and that is, so now that we've looked at the metrics and the KPIs and we have that information available, what are some of the typical next steps or actions that are driven from those metrics?
One that I even previously mentioned is that PDM effectiveness KPI, where you can measure how frequently or infrequently are you performing your PDM, right? So that's that 6-to-1 rule. If there's 6 inspections per find, use that. If you have that KPI that you're measuring, you can drive actions from that, saying, well, you know what, we took a stab and we thought when we initially set this up that every month would be good, but we've been measuring this for 2 years and we haven't found anything. Well, let's change that frequency and make it every 2 months or every 3 months. So that would be one type of typical action is using your KPIs to meet your targets. But I would say even more so, one major action is your predictive maintenance program should be triggering some portion of your root cause analysis program for your site. And what I mean by that is if you have a failure mode on a critical piece of equipment, Predictive will help you detect it earlier, but it doesn't necessarily change how often the failure occurs, right? So that failure frequency or that failure probability doesn't change with predictive maintenance. It just helps you find it quicker. So if you find a bearing defect and you replace it, if you're not changing anything else in the system and you're installing it the same way and you're using the same maintenance practices, it's going to still fail around with the same time frame. So if you wanted to reduce the failures, you need to maybe trigger your root cause analysis program and figure out, okay, why did this bearing fail in the first place? It's great that we're finding it earlier, but we want to even prevent that from happening. So certainly triggering that root cause. And when you think about root cause analysis, it shouldn't just be, hey, we found an issue, let's figure out why. That's one portion of it, but you certainly need to focus on the other side, which is, hey, we missed the PDM or we missed a failure that should have been caught on our PDM program. So why did that happen? And that's I talked about a little bit earlier about focusing on your program's failures, quote unquote failures. But if you miss a PDM find, if you missed a failure, hey, let's absolutely figure out why, because that's valuable, right? So was it because the analysis of the vibration data was incorrect, or maybe the wrong alarm levels were set, or hey, we didn't turn the work order in time. We analyzed it, we identified it properly, but it turned out it sat on someone's desk for 30 days before we even put in the work order. So we lost that early detection time. So if you have a missed find, let's figure out why. And that should be triggered by your root cause analysis program.
So is it fair to say, Anil, that if you think about your maintenance program as a family, then your predictive maintenance program needs to be like a brother or sister to the root cause analysis program. But also family members need to include your CMMS so that you can log everything and that you can make sure that the right work order triggers are happening. But then you also have to have your cousin work management program in place so that even if you are making these discoveries, that they're being acted upon and followed through with. Because you can have all the data in the world, but if you don't do anything with it, then it's kind of wasted money.
Absolutely, Tara. You bring up a good point that all these, we call them programs, root cause analysis program, predictive maintenance, work management, they're all very related, right? And they have either touch points where, predictive may trigger root cause and predictive is on the same level as preventive maintenance. It should be worked with in conjunction, and it all should be encompassed within your CMMS. But with all this data, ultimately, you've got to act upon it. And, driving corrective actions through root cause analysis is a great way. Looking at setting target levels for certain KPIs that you're measuring and determining why you're not meeting them, that's a great way too. So that's very important.
All right, listeners. Well, that's going to wrap up today's episode with Anil Agrawalla in part 2 of Predictive Maintenance. So be sure to check out part 1, which was 2 weeks ago. You can find that on lce.com/podcast. Now, just to recap what we talked about in today's episode, we talked about tracking your PDM program's effectiveness and some of the struggles that kind of go along with tracking. And then Anil also brought up how to measure your PDM program's success and gave us a lot of good tips on how to measure your results. And then finally, we wrapped up with talking about once you get those KPIs and those metrics that you're searching for, what to do next and what he's seen typical actions are that are derived from measuring those KPIs. So with that being said, Neil, I hope you enjoyed your time on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
I did. Yeah, it was good. Thank you for having me, and look forward to talking to you guys in the future.
Yeah, we hope to have you again on soon. So thanks again, Anil.
Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's 2 ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.